Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for having me here. I'm going to say, if you already said that my name is now Moza is part of my name, then let me just point out something which is kind of almost ironic. So I live right here, and this is the site. And it wasn't, I didn't move there after we dug the site, it was the other way around. So yeah, Moza follows me everywhere. So I'm happy to be able to talk about the site. I know you're filming this, but I have a tendency of walking around, so I hope I don't ruin that. Yeah, so I'm going to start, as you see in the handout. We have 4 general segments. We're going to do 2 segments and then a break and then continue, just so I don't explode your mind with Moza, because there's going to be a lot of it. And by the end of this day, you're basically going to know more about Moza than anyone aside from me, I think. So we're going to start with just an introduction to the site, the location, the climate, and how we got to digging there. So Tel Moza is located about 7 kilometers northwest of Jerusalem. And when I say Jerusalem, I'm talking about ancient Jerusalem, so the city of David. It's actually, at this point, almost engulfed inside of the city itself, because Jerusalem has expanded. And just looking at the area that it's situated in, it's situated on a slope about a third of the way down. And in this area we have the old road into Jerusalem. So this is Highway 1. So any of you who have been to Jerusalem up until, let's say, 4 years ago, this is how you would enter. You come down the road and then up into the city. This curve has been nicknamed the death curve, which is one of the reasons they decided to eliminate it, and the excavations were conducted because of it. I'll get to that in a moment. This area is the most, it's a expansive agricultural area in the Jerusalem region. So here's the site, and in the early 90s, a decision was made to eliminate this very dangerous curve of the road and pave a new road right on the slope. But because of the excavations that were done there, it was clear that they could not do that. The excavations yielded an amazing site from the, well, it starts in the Neolithic period, but Iron Age, 10th century until the end of the period. And so they changed the plans accordingly. So you'll see more photos afterwards and you'll be able to see the larger extent. So as I said, the site is located on a slope. Modern day Vessels of Yahweh, which is a township, is located at the very top. But this area has been settled almost continuously for 10 millennia, that is 10,000 years. And different excavations that have been conducted in the area, so be it on the slope in different areas, or the large excavation that's actually happening right now in the valley, have produced unbelievable finds. In fact, they are digging in the valley the largest Neolithic pre-pottery site that has ever been found in Israel. They've opened up hundreds of squares. Each square is 5 square meters, so it's a huge, huge site. The site, the Tel itself, over here also has a Neolithic site, and so we can see that there's movement. People are moving in different areas, but they're all staying in this one region. We have very, very elaborate Iron Age finds, and then it just goes on throughout the different periods. So into the Persian, the Hellenistic, Roman period, there's a very large site. So after the temple, and I know this is kind of veering away from the period that I'm supposed to talk about, but Jerusalem was conquered in the year 70 by the Romans, the 10th Legion, and the veterans of the Legion were actually settled in this area, right over here, we now know, in a site called Colonia, like Kelm in Germany. So there's a Colonia here as well. I'll just finish up and then we can do this. So we have the Roman site now, and continuously into Crusader period as well. And the most modern remains are actually right on the slope itself. The village of Colonia, which preserves the Roman name Colonia, was located on the slope. In 1948, when Israel was established, they ran away and the whole village was just completely dismantled, so we don't even see most of it now. Okay, so this is what I want to show you, a larger site of the area. So this is the immediate area that Moza is located in, and I just want to show you some of the Iron Age sites that are in the very close vicinity. I'm not going too far, and the reason I'm showing you this is because towards the end of the seminar today, I'm going to try to pull together all of the different elements that I'm talking about, and one of them is the location of the site as the reason for the function of the site. And so if we look at this map here, we have Jerusalem, so the dot here marks the city of David. Here is Moza, and then Moza is actually situated along this river bank, a valley called the Soek Valley, which is one of the main, actually probably the main rivers that, call it a river, we call it a river, but you would call it maybe a valley at most, that drains the whole northern part of the Jerusalem region. And if I could show you images, so 2 weeks ago we had some very strong rain, and the amount of water coming down, it really was a river coming through there. So we have this river, and the site of Ramot, which was just recently excavated, so about 2 years ago. I don't think it's even published yet. And there's some farmhouses from the Iron Age over there, and as we continue on, we get to Courtyard, which is being excavated now by Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University. Possibly the location of a cult place from the Iron Age. Right now, we still don't know it archaeologically. And if we blow this area up a little, just so we can see the real close area of Moza. So here we have this valley coming through, and there are a number of places that have recently been unearthed Iron Age sites right next to Moza. So Enem of Basel on the top, very large Iron Age settlement, and then these two, Beit Zayit is not actually something that you would find in any other place, but I was doing about 4 years ago, I was supervising the settlement of Beit Zayit got from Japan. They got 5,000 olive trees to plant. And so as they were digging up the area, I was there to supervise on behalf of the Antiquities Authority, and you could very clearly see that there's an Iron Age site there, including architecture. And then the Zayit Valley, which was just recently excavated about a month and a half ago, probably a farmhouse or some administrative house. Now the reason I wanted to show you all of this is to show that even though there's a gap here, there are no settlements, Iron Age settlements, that's only because this area is not developed. And most of the sites we have are a result of salvage excavations because an area is being developed. So the minute you start developing an area like you do over here, suddenly all these Iron Age sites pop up. And I think that that means that we're actually in an area that was probably pretty heavily populated during the Iron Age. So if we now look at this photo, and this is one that was taken about 5 years ago. It's a satellite image. I know this is all relative, but for Israel, this is considered very, very green, the image you see here right now. And so you can see this is the Soek Valley coming down here, and this is the Moza Valley, and they converge right at the bottom of the slopes. So here's the site itself, and they then continue on as a subsidiary of the Soek into this creating a very wide basin in this area. And this wide basin is also over centuries and probably millennia, because of the water coming in, a lot of the soil has been drifting in, very good, very fertile soil, and so this area has become very conducive to agriculture. They're also right at the bottom of the site. There are a number of springs. There's another spring up here, but 4 springs that I know that up until the 1950s, that is the mid-20th century, were generating water year-round. Water is really important. In Israel, it's even more important because you don't find water everywhere. So if you just look at the way these springs are almost enveloping the site, it makes it even clearer why the site is located where it is. So it's located on the slope in kind of a saddle in an area that's a little elevated and dominating the whole area around it, above area that is very, it's full of agricultural soil and a whole lot of water. This is a look towards this basin I was talking about, so you can see now how luscious it is. And this area, even until about 2 years ago when the big excavation started here, was used for agriculture and is definitely the most productive, agriculturally most productive region of Jerusalem. So here's what we can say. There's a lot of water in this area. It's the most expansive, fertile agricultural lands in the Jerusalem region. And this is why there's a settlement there for so long. So after all of that very long introduction, yeah, I can see there's going to be issues with what it can read and what it can't. There should be a map behind that, so I'm just going to continue on. No, there's something wrong with the way it's reading. It's not giving the images themselves. I'm not quite sure what to do about it. I'm so not tech savvy, which is one of the reasons probably I'm in archaeology, but it's not. So I think we're going to have to go with very sadly, an old presentation, because I don't know. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay.
Couldn't we just connect your computer?
No, my computer is it's my take everywhere computer, so it doesn't have. We'll be fine. We'll do what we have, and that'll be good. As long as you can see the map, then we're good. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, in the early 1990s, the decision was made to pave a road on the slope, but because it was so clear that there's a lot of archaeology around, before the construction for the road actually started, there were excavations that were done, salvage excavations. They were conducted by Prevalent and along the coast of the Antiquities Authority in 1993, and they found, along with other remains from other periods, they found an elaborate site from the Iron Age. So from the 10th century BC until the beginning of the 6th century BC, the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 by the Babylonians. They identified the site with biblical Moza, mentioned in the book of Joshua as a site in the territory of Benjamin. And generally that identification has not been contested. So these are the areas that Grenouille and Debot excavated. They excavated in 93, and then after about 10 years, the Roads Authority came back with a new plan and said, okay, we're not going to plow through the entire site. What we're going to do is we're going to build a bridge. So it's going to be suspended on pillars. And so we want you to excavate in the area that the pillars are going to be drilled into the rock. And so in 2002, 2003, that's exactly what happened, just in the very specific areas. And actually, those two seasons were done mostly by prehistorians. So Hamoudi Khalayla and Anna Eirich Rose were prehistorians, because by then they had already gotten to the earlier phases, which were the Neolithic, on top of bedrock. And if you can just pick up the book you have there, this publication is the publication of these 3 seasons. So this came out in 2009, Grenouille and Debot, and this is the big publication of Moza so far. So they opened up a number of areas, and the 3 main areas are Area A on the very east of the site, and what they found there were a number of silos. So silos are stone-lined pits in the ground that were used to store grain. They also found parts of 2 storage buildings. And then as we move towards the center of the site in Area D, again, dozens of silos. And in the western part, in Area B, a large public building, which we'll get to in a moment, another possibly domestic building, and some more silos, because that's what Moza is known for, is silos everywhere. So this is a plan of the different areas. So we have area A here, area D, area B. And if you look at area D and A, you can see these round installations. These are the silos, and that's what they look like. And for the people who are going to come to the excavation, you'll see these really well. So dozens of these silos found, different sizes, different depths, mostly with stone pavements on the bottom, and again used to store grain. Now this is a large amount. And Figurine, who actually wrote his PhD on Moza, his whole PhD is the calculation of how many people could these silos actually facilitate. And what he realized is that you have more storage area for grain than the size of than the amount of population based on the size of the site. So along with storage buildings like the one over here that we actually finished excavating in 2012, and dozens of these whole mouth storage jars, they actually named the site, or it got the nickname, the Granary of Jerusalem. So the connection was made between Tel Moza to Jerusalem in the Iron Age too, and what they actually defined was that Moza is a royal granary specializing in grain storage, which supplied its products first and foremost to Jerusalem. So Moza is basically a redistribution site, an administrative site. So all of the grain is collected there and then distributed to Jerusalem through the administration of the Kingdom of Judah. The western most area in this plan is area B, and that's going to be the area that we focus on today. And in this area they found a large building, a public building. And this is the plan of the building, you can see in their publication. This building was nicknamed Building 500, and that's the name of the floor inside the building. And it's a very large building, you can see the scale on the bottom. So it's oriented east to west, north is up. There's a courtyard in the east with some walls over here, a few installations, a large stone staircase that leads up to the entrance to the building. It's a little hard to see, but we'll see it in a moment a little better. And then this very, very large building with this massive wall in the north, which is about 2 meters wide, so it's a really massive wall. And inside the building, they found what they identified as a stylobate. So a stylobate is a low wall with column bases on top, so it supported columns along it. Now the whole southern part of the building was very badly eroded, but you can see that they already identified, or they believed that there was another row of columns to the south. This building had a number of interesting finds. There were 2 pottery sherds with Hebrew inscriptions on it, and this amazing find, which is a scepter head made out of Egyptian blue, and it has a pomegranate on the top, and then 3 tiers of pendant petals on the bottom. And even though it looks quite large, it's only 8 centimeters tall. So it's actually a very small, very finely made artifact. And because of these finds, and because of the size of the building, they had identified it as a public building, possibly of cultic nature. So this was the end of the 1993 excavation, and it was left. The building was mostly unexcavated, and I'm going to remind you that this is a salvage excavation. You don't get to excavate anywhere you want. You have to excavate the area that's going to be ruined, which is what they were doing. So, about 20 years after this big excavation, the road authority decided that they were going to start building the bridge. This was in 2012, but they decided to move the location of the pillars slightly and also expand the bridge, so they needed larger pillars. And so excavations resumed in 2012. And this time I was part of the excavations along with the 2 prehistorians. And the areas that you have marked here are actually the areas where the pillars were going to be placed. So you can see that it's right in the courtyard of this building. What was unexpected is that as the area in the north was being expanded just a little bit, suddenly this unbelievable, unique assemblage of cult artifacts was discovered. And so we asked for the option to actually expand the area excavated and find the context of these artifacts. And so this is what we found, and this is kind of like the end scene. And this is what it looked like when we were done excavating in June of 2013. And before I actually show you the plan and describe the building itself, what I want to do is go chronologically and point out that the building, and this is the eastern wall of the building, is built on top of an earlier silo. This is going to be very important for to make my case afterwards. So over here, you can see the wall of the temple, and it was built right into a pre-existing silo, which was no longer in use. This silo was actually covered up with earth and sealed underneath the floor of the temple. So when the temple was built, this silo no longer exists. This goes very well with 4 more silos, also dated to the Iron 2A, excavated in 1993. And so my point here is that even before the building was constructed, we have silos, and Moza is functioning as a storage site. So we get to the temple finally. So here's the plan of the temple, and this is basically what we discovered after we started peeling back the later phases of Building 500. So Building 500, excavated by Grunert and de Groot, was dated to the very end of the period, so the late 7th, early 6th century BCE. As I said, they identified it as a public building, they associated a possible cultic function, but when we started excavating, we peeled off the later phases, because there were quite a few phases here, and we found the original phase. This original phase is the one that goes with the cultic artifact, and so here is the building. So the whole building is oriented in an east-west orientation. There's a courtyard to the east with different installations, and we'll talk about them in a moment. Then there is a portico right at the entrance, and this portico has a very nice stone column base. It's about 60 centimeters in diameter. So this is actually the one right here. The building is a long room building. The entrance is in the east. And the wall in the north, the same wall I showed you before in Grunert and de Groot's publication, is 2 meters wide. And the reason it's so wide and so massive is because this whole building was built on a slope. And so this wall actually acts as a retaining wall against the slope. And I can tell you that having seen what this last winter, just a few rain pours have done to the site, I can really understand why they needed this massive wall. The whole area just keeps on eroding further and further down because you're right on the curve of the slope. So we have this massive wall with a room to the north. And here we're looking from the north towards this corner, and you can see here's the original corner, and then it was reinforced, making it almost 3 meters wide. So I don't know whether this happened at the very beginning or whether they were feeling like they don't have it's not strong enough, and maybe the water coming down had already started to destabilize the building, but at some point they reinforce that area, and so you get this really, really massive corner. So the building generally has, at least that we know of, 1 chamber, but there's another chamber here to the north. Now, whether this chamber is part of a row of chambers that could have gone along the north, maybe even the west and even the south sides of the building, we don't know yet, and I'm not sure we're ever going to know. And the reason is that the whole southwestern part of the building was completely eroded in ancient times already. So in 1993, when this building was first, or parts of it were first uncovered, this dotted line actually marks the modern terrace line that was there. And so you can see that none of this part is actually preserved, unfortunately. Even so, as we excavated, we only excavated in very, very limited areas. So we excavated over here, and then we excavate over here. The whole central part of the building is actually not excavated at all, which means potentially we can still find quite a bit. So any of you coming on the dig in a week and a half, this is part of what we're going to be doing. What we do see are benches that line the northern and eastern walls of the building. And this type of building, that is the plan of this building, is a very well-known type. So we have this long room with two pillars at the entrance. The northern wall protrudes towards the east, creating a prominent anta. And if we reconstruct this whole building as symmetrical, and we have the anta in the south as well, what we get is what we know as the long room plan, the in antis temples, the North Syrian type. So many different names. We know this type from the 3rd millennia BCE. In the 2nd millennia BCE, it already reaches the southern Levant. So in Israel, during the Bronze Age, we see it. This becomes the forefront of temple plans in the ancient Near East. This is what monumental temples look like. So in archaeology, the minute we find something, we immediately rush to find the parallels. We want to know where we're sitting, what is the context. And so looking for the parallels for the Moza temple, the easiest place to go to is North Syria, because that's where we have these monumental type buildings in the Iron Age. The temple of Indara to the right is a very good parallel, and the reason is that similarly to Moza, it too has a corridor with chambers that envelops the building to the north, to the west, and to the south. The building to the west is from Tel Tainat, so again, northern Syria by cultural association, but actually located in Turkey nowadays. And this building, again, the long room with the two pillars in the entrance. And what we usually get in these buildings is that we have the portico, and then we have another segmentation within the main chamber, which creates the separation of the Holy of Holies located at the very back. In most cases, this Holy of Holies will be an area that you ascend to. You're going up to, it could be a niche, it could be a platform, and that is where we would expect to find the whatever it is that's signifying the deity that you're praying to. So be it some kind of an artifact or a figure of the deity, that's where we would expect to find it. This is why the fact that we have not yet fully excavated Moza and we don't have the western part, the edge of the building, becomes even more important, because it will be really interesting to see what it is that's happening in the west. Is there a niche for some kind of a sculpture? Unclear. So what's happening in Judah? This is very clearly that this building, the plan, is derived from northern Syria, but what happens in Judah during this period? Well, the only other temple that we have following the same plan is the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And the Temple of Solomon is very, described in great detail in the biblical text. The different materials that we used to build it, the plan is described, and so reconstructing the plan, we know that this is again a long room, also oriented east to west, and then you enter, you have the two pillar bases, and they have names, Boaz and Yachin in the Bible, and you go up to the portico and then into the central hall and the Holy of Holies at the very back, and like Moza and Indara, here too you have the rooms that envelop the building. Now the biggest problem with the Temple of Moza is that archaeologically it's virtually non-existent. It's simply not there. We never excavated it. We're never going to get a chance to excavate it, so we don't know that it's really there. There is only one other temple that has been excavated so far in Judah, and that is the Temple of Arad. And Arad is a small military garrison at the very southern part of Judah. And this temple used to be dated to the 10th and maybe 9th. Now it's dated to the 8th century, so the dates are changing constantly. But it's very, very different. So this is the whole complex. Here we're in the courtyard and we have the altar, but then this is the actual temple building. And so really this is not a long room plan at all. In fact, it's a broad room plan when you look at the temple. And this type of plan is actually the type of plan that we know for domestic buildings during this period. It's the 4-room house. And so we see it in domestic buildings, we see it in public buildings, we even see it in tombs, but it is not the monumental temple plan that we know from the ancient Near East. And so it's very different, it's also much smaller, and it's also later. It's at least 100 years later than Moza. So coming back to what's going on at Moza, we have inside the building, right abutting the northern bench, 5 stones that seem to have been intentionally placed on the floor. They're not very large stones, but they were placed on their narrow side. And so, to me, they immediately invoke the idea of standing stones, of matzevot, especially because there were only 5 of them, and there were no other stones around. So you can't say, okay, this is just part of a collapse, and this is what we saw left behind. And it reminds me very much of what's going on in Dan. Dan to the north has, if you go into the central gate complex walking up to the city, there are a number of places where you have these sets of 5 standing stones. And in one case, the stones are placed right next to the wall, and in front of them there is a bench. So what does it mean? What does the number 5 mean in this case? Why are they going for number 5? Is it 5 different deities, as suggested by some people? I don't know what it's symbolizing, but it looks, it's something that definitely we need to look into. So the building itself, as I said, was very partially excavated, but we did find 2 floors. So the first floor was found in the eastern edge of the building, and that's this packed earth floor with plaster above it. And then the second floor was found inside the building, and that's a stone pavement. It was actually excavated in 1993, and it's about 20 centimeters higher than the plaster floor in the east. So now the question becomes, is this simply a second phase? That is, if we were to dig out this stone pavement, would we then get to the original plaster floor underneath it? Or are we actually seeing a differentiation between 2 different chambers inside the building, where you come in at one level with a plaster floor, and then you ascend into the next chamber, and you have a stone pavement? And that would be very interesting, because right now we don't have a wall that creates a separation, but maybe this is an indication of what's going on. So again, this has to be checked further. So coming back now to the general plan, and we're going to focus on the courtyard. So as I said, the building has a large courtyard in the east with many different installations. And what's key to remember is that even though we want to discover the building and we want to see what's going on inside the building, in ancient times, when people used this temple, they did not go into the temple. So it was only the high priest who got to go into the temple. All of the rituals, all of the cultic behavior actually happened in the courtyard. So this is really where we're going to see most of the changes, and this is where we're going to find most of our artifacts, and this is how we're going to reconstruct what people were actually doing and what the cult looked like. And so I'm going to start with this key element, which is actually the first element we saw that really indicated that we're talking about a temple, and that is the altar. And it's located right across from the entrance. So you have this main axis of the whole complex, and the altar is right in front of the entrance. And here's a photo of it. So it was only preserved to about 3 courses high. It's not very large. It's 1.4 meters by 1.35 meters. And I assume that the top part of it was actually dismantled in antiquity. To the northeast of the altar is a pit, and you can see it here in the photo. And this pit, which was dug into the floor, had a whole lot of ash and animal bones. And some of these animal bones were cut. They had butchery marks on them, and some of them were burnt. And they are now being processed by Dr. Rida Sapir-Chen from Tel Aviv University. But a very preliminary analysis of these bones has already indicated that we're talking about mostly cattle. So most of this is cattle, and then some sheep and goat. And there is probably one bone that belongs to a pig, but I am assured by Lidar that there is no Iron Age bone assemblage in Israel that does not have at least one pig bone, contrary to what we would think. And generally, it seems like we're talking about the animals or the refuse of the animals that were sacrificed on the altar. And so this makes a lot of sense because we know in temples we expect to see anything that has to do with the ritual activity is going to remain in the temple area. The minute you sacrifice an animal, it itself becomes part of the religious sphere, and so you can't just dump out the remains. You have to dump them within the cultic complex. Same is true for artifacts as well. And directly to the north of this pit is a podium, a stone-built podium, and I think that this podium probably was where they placed a lot of the artifacts. So as people were coming in to perform rituals, they were bringing offerings with them and placed some of them on the podium as well, and you'll see in a moment why I think that that's the location. Between the pit, and actually overlapping the pit a little bit, and the podium, is where the cultic assemblage was found. So this is what it looked like when it was found in the field, and you can see that it's this mass of artifacts made out of clay. They were all just kind of strewn in one area on top of the floor. And I don't know how easy it is to see this here, but if you kind of really look at this, you'll see that what we have here are parts of figurines that had been smashed in situ, that is, in their location. This element is the very top of this element, which is the base of a huge cult stand, standing on the floor. And all of these artifacts and vessels are all part of the cultic assemblage. So I'm going to show you very specific things that are unusual, but it's important to point out that there are also a lot of regular daily, what we would call daily wear. That is, we have bowls and we have storage jars, and we have cooking pots, etc. Now these are all part of the cultic assemblage. So when people would come to the temple, they would bring offerings, they would bring them in bowls, they would bring them in storage jars. And then, as I said, the minute you bring something in that vessel, the vessel itself now becomes important. So if you will, I can tell you in my house, growing up, my mother had a special set of china that was only for holidays, right? So if anybody else would come into our house and see this china, they'd think, okay, it's just regular china, just like anything else. But to me, I would never think of using it for just a regular meal. To me, it has, important significance, and so the minute you use it, you identify it with something that's cultic, ritual, etc. It stays imbued in that religious function, and same with all of these artifacts. So even though we're talking about regular bowls, storage jars, etc., they have to be viewed as part of the cultic assemblage. Having said that, I'm not going to talk about all of those right now, just about the unique finds. So the cultic artifacts, we're going to start with the showstoppers. 4 figurines, at least 4 figurines were found in the assemblage. 2 of them are anthropomorphic, so that's human figures. And you can see them here. So the top one with the 3 different angles, and the bottom one, call them A and B just to make life easier. And they have very similar characteristics. So they have the similar proportions to the face. In both cases, the eyes were made as pellets, that is, balls of clay that were adhered to the face and then punctured to simulate the pupil. Big, bulky noses, big, bulky ears, a very prominent chin, and this puncturing technique that they also use to create the nostrils. So you can't see it here because of the angle, but the nostrils are also punctured. The headdress, which they both have, is this round, slightly elevated headdress, which may be perhaps an indication of the Aegean polos, which we know mostly in the Aegean on female figurines, but in the southern Levant we know on male figurines as well, especially in Philistia, so maybe we're getting this through Philistia. And then one of, I think, the cutest elements here is the hair. The hair is done very nicely. They clearly wanted to indicate these strands of hair with curls at the bottom. So even though the hair of figurine A is mostly broken off, you can still see one of the curls here, but then figurine B shows us what the hair must have looked like also on A. So you have these strands ending in the single curl, almost like the Assyrian headdresses, actually. So these two look pretty much like each other, but the question is whether they look like anything else. And before I say that, I just want to point out that this puncturing we can see also on the chin of figurine A, puncturing that's actually simulating the beard. So we can definitely say that the top figurine is male. Now, does that mean that the bottom figurine is female because it doesn't have an indication of the chin, of the beard? I'm not sure. I think we need to be very careful. But what the bottom figurine does have is the addition of clay on the sides of the cheeks. And I haven't seen that anywhere else. To me, it reminds me of these movies you watch with the English lords that have this the massive cheeks. And maybe there is a connection in that maybe this is an indication of someone who is very rich and well off, because we know that in ancient times, the larger you were, the more money you had, right? That's an indication. People who were larger were thought to have had more money. So perhaps there's correlation, but again, definitely male on top, not clear male or female on the bottom. So looking for parallels, it becomes very, very difficult because we are talking about Iron Age 2A, the early 9th century BC. And I should point out that the dating of this phase is based solely on pottery. So we have pottery from the foundation of the building, we have pottery on top of the floors, but it's not based on any organic matter or carbon-14 dating, which is what I'm hoping we'll do in our excavation this coming season. So it becomes very difficult to find parallels because in the ancient Near East, in the late Bronze Age, in the Iron Age 1, there are figurines, clay figurines, including male clay figurines. But the moment you move into the Iron Age 2A, they almost disappear. It's really hard to find figurines, and then they only come back from the late 9th and early 8th century on. And so Moza is kind of sitting, almost it's like an island chronologically. So it's very hard to find parallels, and most of the parallels are from the Iron Age 1. So the closest parallel, geographically and chronologically, is one from Khirbet Kayafa, which you may have heard of. And I won't go into whether this site is Judeite or Israelite or Canaanite because there are different schools of thought here. Regardless, I will point out there is similarity in the technique. So we're looking at the profile here. This bulky nose, the eyes are done in the same way, the same round headdress and the puncturing technique, but otherwise pretty different. The proportions are very different. It's not one that I'd rush to say, oh, here's my parallel to Moza. The second one is from Tel Bakash. Again, I only brought it, I don't think it's very similar, but just because there's so few that I pretty much brought all of the ones that exist. And then I think that the best parallel is actually this Philistine figurine from the Iron One, the 11th century BC, from Ashdod. And in this case, we can see that the proportions of the face are very similar. The headdress is very similar. The nose is broken off, but you can see it's a prominent nose. And even this puncturing in the chin, that's probably also simulating the beard over here. Moving on to what's going on in the north, so the Kingdom of Israel. Here are two figurines, Iron Age 1, one from Bet She'an, one from Tel Kinrot. And the one from Bet She'an I think is very, very different. I'm only showing it because also here you have these strands of hair. That is, they took the time to actually create hair locks. I think the one from Tel Kinrot is probably closer. We have the technique of the puncturing. Here you can see the puncturing of the nostrils as well. So this one is maybe a little bit more similar. And then some of the best parallels come from Jordan. So Edomite figurines, one from Deir Alla and one from Botzra, but these are later. So these are 8th century, so they're later than Moza. So generally what you can see here is that the parallels that we can find, or even not very good parallels, but just other figurines, are either earlier or later. So again, this chronological vacuum that has to be addressed somehow, because Moza is clearly not making anything up. So who are they imitating? Who are they getting all of this influence from? And that's a really big question. we do have figures, even if not figurines, but figures do exist during this time, and we see them on cultic, very clear cultic artifacts. So be it cult stands or clay altars or shrine moles from different areas. So Philistia we have, Israel, Jordan and Pella, and even Jerusalem, that do have during the Iron Age figures that are molded. And so maybe this is the influence coming in from the different figures and not necessarily actual figurines. The second pair of figurines from Moza are these two anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, figurines. I believe they both depict horses. The one on the left definitely depicts a horse. The one on the right looks like a dog to me, but after much consideration and analysis, I determined it must be a horse. So this one is, the one on the right is a solid figurine. It's pretty small and it's pretty schematic generally, but it has very interesting aspects. First of all, this here you can see the nostrils on both of these figurines actually, the nostrils that are punctured, and the same technique to create the eyes, these punctured pellets. But what the one on the right has is the remains of a pack or maybe a rider that were on it, sitting on it. And on the sides of the eyes, it has the blinkers, the blinders, that you only see on horses or mules or donkeys. So these are pack animals, and so that's why it's clearly one of those. Looking for the parallels for this figurine is very difficult. I didn't find any good ones during this period because there are practically no figurines. I mean, you could probably count them on two hands, the amount of figurines you have during this period in the region. But from the 8th century on, in the whole region, be it Judah or Philistia or Jordan, you suddenly have this boom of figurines everywhere. And in fact, when you excavate in Judah and particularly in Jerusalem, and you're digging 8th to 6th century, you're going to find hundreds of these figurines. Everywhere you dig, you're going to find them. But these are much later. These are the best parallels I have, but Moza is sitting 100, almost 200 years earlier, so again, what's going on here? The second figurine is this very clear horse figurine, and you can see different angles of it. It's much larger, and it's made in a completely different technique. So the body itself was made on a wheel, and it's hollow, but the limbs and the head and the neck were made by hand, and they're solid, and they were stuck then to the hollow body. The figurine is burnished, so that's this red shine that you see is just the burnishing of the figurine. It's not paint on it. And you can see that the trappings for on the head were done by incision, so they incised onto the heads, but then they also added this plastic decoration to create the reins, which had mostly broken off, and the rider that was sitting on top. And if you look especially on the bottom left, you'll see very well, you can see the feet of the rider that was sitting on top of it. So this is a very, very clear horse and rider figurine. But it's a little bit odd, because look at where the feet are actually positioned on the horse. This is not where you'd expect to see the feet of a rider. In later periods, when we see these horse and rider figurines, they're much more schematic than this. And the legs are either dangling down the sides, or else the whole bottom part is not at all presented. They kind of create the top part and they fuse it into the horse. So I couldn't find any good parallels for this. But it just seems like a very odd position to me. So I was trying to figure out, and if you look at the top photo here, you can see the beginning of the leg going up. There is nothing on the back of this figurine to indicate a breaking point. That is, it's not like we can see that the figure was sitting on the horse. But he's not exactly standing on the horse. So to me, it almost looks like a jockey position, where you're putting your feet on the sides pretty high up and you're kind of crouched up. It's very odd. Now, why am I talking about it for so long? Because in the ancient Near East, if you see a figure standing on an animal, that's a deity. Only deities get to stand on animals. And this would be monumental, because then we're saying that this is actually a depiction of the deity, probably that was worshipped in the temple. I don't think that's the case. I think this is some kind of human somehow positioned on the animal, but again, something to think about. And lastly, I'd like to point out this tail called the Perky Tale, which just goes up and then underneath between the legs. So again, looking for the parallels for this, the very, very few figurines we find in Judah during this time are very schematic. So this is the head, the neck and the head of a horse figurine. So it's nothing like the figurines we have. And this is the clearest one I could find out of the very few we have. But then looking for parallels, we do see similarities to figurines in the north. So the north, the northern valleys mostly, Kingdom of Israel, and then further north, do have figurines of horses during this time. They also have figurine-shaped vessels. And over there you can see the same type of trappings. And even looking at this figurine from Samaria, you can see the same Perky Tale. This Perky Tale, and generally also the whole composition, is very similar to what we see in Phoenicia, but later on. So this is later. And you can see this one example from Aviv, also burnished, one of the only other burnished figurines that I could find. But here you see what I mean about the rider on top. You can only see the top part, and then the bottom kind of fuses together with the horse. So pretty different. So again, where's Moza getting the inspiration from? Because I don't think that there's some amazing artisan that's sitting in Moza and coming up with all of this. This is clearly set within the ancient Near East, and so we have to find this missing link. And I'm not going to give you the answer today. I'm just raising the question today. Along with these figurines, we also found this pomegranate-shaped pendant, so it has a hole on the top. And this is probably a pendant that was suspended on a cult stand. So here we have a later example from Ein Chatzivah. This is an Edomite shrine. But the inspiration here is clearly from the late Bronze Age. And in the late Bronze Age, we had these tripod bronze vessels that had bronze-shaped, pomegranate-shaped pendants that were suspended on them. And then they just are taken into the Iron Age and now made out of clay and suspended on other different kinds of artifacts. This pendant pedal is a recurring motif. It's actually one of the strongest motifs in the cult of Iron Age Levant, I would say. And what we found is just a piece. It's a piece of clay that's shaped as these pendant petals and was clearly detached from some vessel. And again, I'm showing you this scepter head that was found in 1993 at Moza, and again, the same element of the pendant petals. We found a bunch of bowls with these pendant petals in different forms, very large bowls that could be part of chalices or bowls that were on the top of cult stands. And just to show you, nothing is sitting on itself. It's all part of what's going on in the ancient Near East. And so just a few examples. We have an example of an incense burner cult stand that was found in the temple at Arad. And we have this base of a cult stand with a tall stem and the bowl on top. And both the stem has the pendant petals and the bowl has the pendant petals as well. Ta'anach, in which cult stands we'll see in a moment were found. Again, the same kind of stand with the pendant petals. Same in Megiddo with this bowl that could be slotted in and out. And you can see again on the stem the pendant petals and on the bowl. Tel Amal, and in Samaria where they only found the petals themselves. So this is just to show you that Moza is sitting within what's going on in the southern Levant. It's not making up anything. These are conventions of the decorations we use for cult artifacts during this period. So looking at the cult stand that we found at Moza, and I showed you before when we were looking at the assemblage in situ, the base was actually positioned still on the floor. The base is made as a bowl, very massive, it's pretty heavy actually, that was then flipped over, and then plastic decorations were added to create these low reliefs. So it's pretty broken off, but here we're looking at the front and two of the reliefs on the side, and here we're looking at the side. So what we have is two halves of animals that were attached from the sides, So when you're looking at the front, you're seeing these two animals as if they're coming towards you. And here's just in a kind of trying to show you in the red outline here. So this is what we're looking at over here. So we can see the paw, the front paw over here. This is the body, the bottom back leg, and then the tail coming up over here. Now, if you look at this paw is what tells us what animal it is, because this paw belongs to a lion. So this is a lion's body. But it doesn't mean it has to be a lion that's depicted here, because we know another animal that has a lion's body, and that's the Sphinx. And both of these animals are actually very prevalent in cultic imagery in the ancient Near East. And what makes me think that this may be a Sphinx is this piece of clay that we found in the assemblage. It was actually found, it fell right into the base of the stand. And you can see the points of detachment on the very end, and trying to figure out where it could go, it could very well be the wing of a Sphinx. So whether it is or not, I'm not positive. So we're either talking about a lion, a pair of lions, or a pair of sphinxes on the side here. Now, pairs of lions and sphinxes we know abundantly from cultic imagery in the ancient Near East, from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And that is because both of these animals are protective animals. Both symbolize both deities and royalty, and strength and power. So we often find them in pairs. In this case, here are just a few examples from cult stands from this period. So the two cult stands on the left are from Tanakh, dated to the 10th century BC. And in both cases, we have pairs of lions and sphinxes, one above the other. So here are the two lions, sphinxes, lions, and then griffins on the top. And if we look at this, at the facade here, we have a very clear religious iconography, which is the goddess holding on to the two lions. Again, a very well-known religious imagery of the time. So, again, superimposed pairs of lions and sphinxes. Megiddo, we have this shrine model with the two sphinxes on the side. Yavne, two horses in a shrine model. So just to show you again, anywhere you go in this region, when you find cultic artifacts, then you're usually going to find these images. So Moza does not stand out in this. To the contrary, it just shows how well Moza fits within the cultic imagery of the ancient Near East. We also find these pairs of lions and sphinxes at the entrance to public buildings, notably temples and palaces. So in this case, we have the palace at Tel Khalaf, and you can see the lion here, the sphinx here, carved out of orthostats. And the same at the Temple of Ein Dara. The Temple of Ein Dara, I remind you, is one of the best parallels architecturally to the Temple of Moza. And here we have, again, these pairs of sphinxes and lions at the entrance to the temple. In this case, we're talking about northern Syria. This is the center of where everything is happening. Moza is the periphery. So here, things are done in higher, I'd say, quality there. They are carved out of orthostats, basalt orthostats. And as a side note, the Temple of Ein Dara, which you can see is exquisite, in January of 2018, during the fighting in that region, was completely bombed to shreds. So don't see any of this anymore. It's a good thing we have these images. So we were talking about the iconography of what we see on the cult stand, but it's also the shape of the cult stand at Moza that is important, because in the Iron Age 2A and 2B, we find the same type of cult stands over and over and over, and again, it doesn't matter where we go, we find them. And so here we have a few examples from Judah. We have the one from Arad, from the temple at Arad. We have some from possible cult room at Lachish, even from Jerusalem. And then moving on in Israel, we just find them anywhere. These are such clear cultic artifacts that many times we find these artifacts, even though we don't find the actual cult place, and we know that there was cult, they were part of a cultic ritual or possibly originate in a cult place. So again, Philistia, Israel, they all use the same type of vessel, they all use the same morphology of the vessel, and they all use the same elements. Maybe they're not indicating the same, maybe they don't have the same symbolism everywhere, but they all use the same motifs. That allows us to try and reconstruct the stand at Moza, and I'm basing the reconstruction on the fact that we have several pieces that are made of the same clay, and you can see the same technique of production, and the vessels we saw just now. And so looking at the few elements, so we have the base of the stand here with the stem, and here are the paws and the lions or sphinxes on the side. We have this pendant petal decoration, and we have this really, really large bowl with the pendant petals. And so in trying to decorate, this pendant petal would go somewhere along the stem, I'm not exactly sure where, and then the bowl would go on the top. And this is the drawing of the section of it. So the way I view it is, I think these pendant petals were actually attached to the stem, and then you had this big bowl that was slotted in. Why slotted in? Because you're using this bowl to either burn incense or to place libations or offerings, and every now and then you're going to want to clean it out, or else maybe it breaks. And in order not to have to create the whole stand every time again, it's just easier to have a bowl that you can take in and out all the time. And again, we know this from Megiddo, we know this from other places as well. Now, this whole stand is pretty massive, and it's at least 50 centimeters tall, based on the what we have so far, and there may have been additional parts. It's very, very heavy, and again, I can tell you this because just trying to lift the base of it is really difficult. And I think this is what we can call semi-permanent furniture inside of the temple. That is, I don't think it's something that was moved around a lot. You could move it around, but you didn't. And I think it was one of the focal points of the different rituals that were held in the courtyard. And in fact, I even think that the place that we found the base is exactly the location that it was originally positioned, and that when they were breaking the artifacts, and we'll talk about that in a moment, they broke the top off, but then the base was so massive it just stayed in place. So if I sum this up, I want to point out that all of these artifacts, all of the different things we looked at now, be it the figurines or the vessels, are made of the same composition, of the same Moza marl, local clay found in the region, and probably made in the same workshop, and definitely made specifically to be used in the rituals held at the temple at Moza. So this is very, very local. Along with this, we can see that the stylistic and iconographic traditions that are expressed in the temple at Moza, in the architecture, in the different vessels and the different artifacts, are derived from Aegean, probably the Aegean world, North Syria, Phoenicia, Philistia, and maybe even Edom. So we have this amalgamation of different influences, which then leads me to say the following, which is that during the formative period of the so-called Israelite religion, it's not a term I like to use, but let's say maybe cult in Judah, it was very diverse, and it exhibited syncretism of traditions that were derived also from surrounding cultures, but also from the ancient Near East. That is, they were still continuing what was being done from the 3rd millennia BCE. So we're talking really about just the beginning of cult forming in what would become the kingdom of Judah and the religion of the Judaites. Moving into how all of this ended, or how this first phase actually ceased to be. And I'm going to talk about the courtyard. As I said, the changes we see are mostly in the courtyard, not very much going on inside the building, which was presumably constantly being cleared out as well. And all these artifacts were found in a very specific place, very delineated area. And in fact, what we see is that right before they were placed, 2 walls, so one over here and one over here, pretty shabby walls, were built, and they created kind of a box. So a box where the podium is the northern delineation, then you have the 2 walls on the side, and the pit is to the south. And all of these artifacts were placed in this one place in the middle. And they were intentionally broken over there because we did some restoration. The figurines were completely restored. The cult stand was partially restored. So it's clear that someone broke them over there. And the way I see this is that at some point, after the temple had been used for I don't know how many years, there was a need to renew all of the vessels and to renew the different elements there. This we see constantly in the ancient Near East. We see it in different temples. The temple of Ishtar at Muzi, the late Bronze Age temple, shows that very well. And what they do is they collect all of the cult artifacts from the temple, from the different areas that were used in the courtyard. They place them all in one location. They break them so that they're no longer valid cult artifacts. And then they bury them. And all of this has to be done inside the temple because this is an act of reverence. This is showing that this is the same population still using the temple. These vessels still have the symbolic religious ritual, and so you can't just throw them out, but you're trying to now decommission them and create changes. And so that's what they do. And all of the vessels were covered up by this layer of earth and pieces of plaster. This is a layer we didn't see anywhere else on the site, so it's very clear that this was done specifically just to cover them up. And after that, the vessels, the podium, the altar, all of that was all completely covered up with earth and sealed underneath a floor. There was a second phase of the courtyard of the temple, so you no longer have all these installations, you no longer see them, but you're still using the courtyard. And in this, it's a little hard to see, but in this photo we have, here's one of the walls. It's actually this wall, so we're actually looking we're looking from the north, and so we see this wall here, and right over here is the altar, and this is the floor. So the floor really seals it all right underneath. A very interesting thing that they do is that right above the area where the cultic artifacts are laid, they build this, I don't know what to call it, some kind of a flagstone pavement or a podium of sorts, just these 4 stones, but large stones that are relatively flat, and they place them above the area where they deposited the cult artifacts. And that's then embedded in the floor. So they're actually indicating the area of the cult vessels. And again, this is just showing us that there's continuity and that we're talking about the same population and that the building is still functioning as a temple. Because otherwise they wouldn't care. They wouldn't try to very carefully deposit all this, and they won't try to mark the location of where the cult artifacts are. The next phase, there's a third phase and possibly also the 4th phase of the temple. This is where we see a bigger change. In all of these phases, there's constantly a new floor that's being deposited in the courtyard and elevating the floor level of the courtyard. And at the same time, the same thing is happening in the portico, so at the entrance to the building. And in this case, in the 3rd phase, they place another floor, a white plaster floor in the courtyard, but they do a whole lot more. They extend the anta, protruding here to the east, and then they repave the portico, and they build a massive stone staircase leading up towards the building. And here are the photos. So these photos were taken when we started our excavation, and what they show you is the negative of the areas that were excavated in 1993, yeah? And this is what we had when we came. So this was a bulk, so it wasn't touched, but everything else was excavated to different elevations already around us. But here we're looking towards the southwest, and over here we're looking towards the west, and you can see the white plaster floor here and here, it's the same one, going right up to this big stone staircase that leads up towards the entrance to the building. There's a new wall that's built probably to create the delineation of the courtyard in the north. And right over here, this element, which I think, and I can't positively say, but I think is possibly another altar that goes along with this phase. It's situated directly across the entrance, and even though it's pretty damaged, you can see the square outline here. So possibly another altar, that's not 100% clear, but if you look at it from the side, here's the possible late altar, and then what you see down here is the earlier altar. So you can see they're almost at the same place, and you can see the different phases going up. So this is what happens in the courtyard. You see this elevation of floors. We're covering up different elements, then creating new elements. And in this late phase, they build 2 more installations. Again, just showing that all of this is still functioning as a temple. This was excavated, the latest phase was excavated mostly by Grunert and de Groot, and they dated it all to the very end of the Iron Age. And this is really important because in trying to understand how long this building continued to function as a temple, this is a big key element. If it continued to function as a temple until the very end of the Iron Age, then, and we'll get to this in the second half of the seminar, then talking about the reforms happening in Judah, and the fact that we don't expect to see cult places outside of Jerusalem at the very end of the period, this becomes an interesting kind of point of contention, I would call it. And what we say in Israel, we call this whole topic explosive, because it can have a lot of implications. So here's what we have going on in this later phase. And again, are we talking about a cult place still functioning until the end of the Iron Age? I think this is a good time to stop. And if you have some questions now, this was all to give you now know what the temple is, what was in the temple, the different phases. And when we come back, we're going to start talking about what the implications are and how to look at Moza in a broader context, both biblical and archaeological. So if you have any questions so far?
Yes, maybe you said, but I didn't tell you. What is the date of the end of the phase 2 and the rebuilding and very...
Yeah. So it's a great question, actually. So from what as I showed you, we excavated what was left over throughout 4 different seasons of excavation. We have 2, even 3 expeditions, I recall, and each one excavating to different depths in different places, but right next to each other. And one of the things that I'm doing now is I'm rebuilding everything. I'm synchronizing everything. So I'm going through with information from Tzvika, Nalon, de Groot, and the Grunert's data, but I'm not based on the publication. So publication only has some of the information. I have their actual documentation because the excavation was published 10 years ago, so it's public record now. And so I have all this information, and I'm trying to synchronize, and by doing that, I'm actually finding more parts of the floors that I didn't know existed. They suddenly have the 3rd floor, the 4th floor in different places. And what I realize I'll have to do is pull out the pottery from their publication, from their excavation as well, and then try to figure out the date. So right now, what I know based on my excavation is that the first 2 phases for sure are early 9th century. But then but we're not really sure when the 3rd and the 4th phases come in, whether they're 8th century or go beyond that. One of the key elements for the excavation coming up in a week and a half is going to be to get datable material, organic material, and using not only pottery, which is very problematic in this period, but actually being able to use different modern technologies and sciences to really pinpoint the different dates of the phases. I'll also say, which I did not mention, is that I think that the whole latest phase of the temple, we're not seeing at all. I think that it completely eroded. I don't think that the 4th floor that I have is the latest one. So it's very interesting because, again, everything is dated to the very end of the Iron Age in the publication, but it doesn't fit with what we've been finding. So we'll have to check that. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, we'll kind of go faster here. Okay, so after introducing the site, introducing the temple, all the different finds, etc., just starting to touch on what the implications could potentially be and Moza in context. So again, as I said, I don't really like the term Israelite religion, but for the greater good, I'm doing it. So assuming we accept that there was a Temple of Solomon and that it was built somewhere in the 10th, 9th century, then the temple at Moza existed alongside this temple from its creation. And this can prove pretty difficult for a lot of people to accept. And so the big question is this an abnormality? Is Moza indicating something that goes against what we would assume the so-called legitimate cult and religion of Judah should be during this period, or maybe not. And so in order to kind of take a deeper look into this, I'm going to very generally mention the biblical account. I am not a biblical scholar, but we're going to touch on this a little bit and then talk about the archaeological finds and see how Moza fits in. So in the biblical narratives, we have occasional citing of attempts made by, be it the judges or the kings of the kingdom of Judah, to quell illicit pagan behavior. So anything they figure is not part of the legitimate cult has to be stopped. And this includes extensive purging of the land of any form of cultic practice which is not part of the centralized religion performed by the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem. Temple of Jerusalem, according to the biblical text, is the place that God chose to put his name in. And so we're going to be looking at the reforms now to see whether Moza can be explained even given the reforms. But I should mention that even if we accept that the reforms mentioned in the biblical text did actually happen historically, at least the first reform, at least Hezekiah's reform, happening at the end of the 8th century, is much, much later. Well, both of them much later, and they don't apply to the first two phases of Moza. So the first two phases happen before the so-called reforms happen. But as I said, if the temple does continue until the end of the period, then how do we explain it with the reforms? So the first reform was done by Hezekiah, according to the biblical text, at the late 8th century BCE. And I'm not going to read all of this. I'm just going to point out that Hezekiah removes the high places and he breaks the sacred pillars and cuts down the Asherah. And he's doing all of this, and these are places of worship that were created by his father David and by the kings that preceded him. Same is true for Josiah. Josiah's reform about 100 years later, at the late 7th century BCE. It's a much more detailed account of religious reform. And he says, then the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the hosts of the heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron, etc., etc. He did away with the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah and in the surrounding area of Jerusalem. So this is telling us that there was worship for different deities, different gods that are known from the ancient Near East. And this is telling us that this was done as part of the legitimate worship and religion sponsored by the kings of Judah, at least until Josiah comes along. So up until the late 7th century, we know that there are different places of worship for the God of Israel, for different gods that are being worshipped by the Judaites. And this is based on the biblical text. So they're so common, these different cultural rituals, that we have to keep on. You have not only one reform, you have these two reforms. Hezekiah does it, 100 years later, Josiah has to do an even bigger one. Clearly this is going on. And what this implies is that even after the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, the population and the practiced religion did not strictly adhere to what we see or what is perceived as the proper legitimate religion or religious behavior. Biblical scholars will be the first ones to say this was all written pretty late on anyway, so it doesn't really, these reforms and so-called legitimate worship of the God of Israel, only in Jerusalem, only in a very specific way anyway, doesn't really describe the whole period. So now, we do have some cult places that the biblical texts mention. Interestingly, Moza is not mentioned, which is another very bizarre thing. It's not that they're not mentioning any places. There are places mentioned as legitimate places of worship. So, could it be that the reason that Moza is not mentioned is because Moza actually kept on going? That Moza was still throughout the Iron Age and even until the end of the period a cult place? Whereas most of these other cult places were decommissioned pretty early on, and so it's not a problem to mention them even later. So, interesting question. So the biblical texts do show us that there is worship and cult being conducted outside of Jerusalem. What do the archaeological finds say? So I'm going to start with the site of Untitled Chapter in northeastern Sinai, dated to the 9th to 8th centuries BCE. And at this site, 2 pithoi, so large storage jars, were found with inscriptions in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, on them. And on both of them, we have the mention of Yahweh by name. In one, he's mentioned of Yahweh Shomron, Yahweh of Samaria, and in one, Yahweh Teman. Teman is a general name for the south of Israel. Shomron is the capital of the kingdom of Israel. So what we can see here are, these are local personifications of the God of Israel. He's being worshipped as his local or regional name, and this again fits very well into the ancient Near East, where we know that deities had local versions. For instance, if we look at Baal, we have Baal Chatzor, we have Baal Tzafon, Baal of the different places, the god Baal based on where he was worshipped. And so we have the same thing going on for Yahweh. So it's not only Yahweh of Jerusalem, it's Yahweh of the different regions. The Mesha stele, I think, is one of the best examples. This is a stele, a commemorative stele that was created by Mesha, the king of Moab, and he talks about his wars against the kingdom of Israel, and he conquered parts of the kingdom of Israel, including the city of Nevo, the Israelite Nevo. And he says, and now Chemosh, the Moabite god, said to me, go take Nevo from Israel, and I took from there the vessels of Yahweh. He actually names the vessels of Yahweh means the cultic vessels from the building that is built for Yahweh, from the temple, and dragged them before Chemosh. So he's taking the vessels from a temple for the God of Israel at Nevo, and he's placing them in a new temple that he's building for his own God, Chemosh. So yes, temple, no temple. Moshe is telling us in the 9th century that there was a temple there for the God of Israel. The Lachish relief is a relief found in Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, and it depicts the conquest of Lachish, the big Judaic town, in 701 BC. And in this, in one of the segments of the relief, we can see, and here's a drawing, so we can see a procession of soldiers that are carrying the spoils of the city, spoils that were taken when Lachish was conquered, and pretty close to the beginning of the procession, we see these 2 soldiers. They're all holding something. The soldier here, you see these 2, and they're holding these huge stands. And if you look closely at the stands, you'll see that they're exactly the type of stand that we've been looking at. These tall stems, and they have the pendant petals, and then the bowl on the top. Now, Nadav Ne'eman already noted that in the Assyrian reliefs, what you usually see in the head of the procession are the statues of the god of the city that was sacked. Because that's the way you show your dominance, by taking the god of the city. And the fact that there is no statue means that there was no statue to take, and they take the next best thing, that is the next thing that seems like the main cultic device, which are these stands. And where are these stands coming from? They must be coming from a temple, because that's a kind of artifact you see in temples. We do have other indications of cult places in Judah. So at Arad we have the actual temple, and here's a photo of the temple. Here's the courtyard, the altar, and then you enter into the temple with the niche. You go up, and there's a standing stone in there, and stone altars. Aside from that incense burner, the stand that I showed you from Arad, there are no other finds similar to what I've been mentioning until now. The closest thing is this bronze weight of a lion, but it's probably Assyrian, so probably not actually connected to the cultic activity. In Beersheba, a stone carved altar was found, not like this. This is not the way it was found at all. So pieces of the stone altar with the horns were found actually used in an 8th century storage building. And then it was rebuilt, and suddenly it looks so nice and big and beautiful like this, but this is obviously not the way it was found. But the fact that there was this altar indicates that there was a cult place there. And in Lachish, very debated room with cult artifacts was found, whether the cult artifacts are actually part of the room, that is, this is a cult room, or whether it's a pit that was dug into the room and the artifacts were deposited, don't change the fact that these cult artifacts, which include stands of the type that we saw, and you can see here why they were being found, they clearly derive from a cult place. So I don't know whether it was a full-fledged temple or a cult room or what, but there was a cult place in Lachish for sure. So what we can see here is that if we look at both the biblical and the archaeological evidences, a cult place dedicated to, be it Yahweh or other deities, could have been located in any settlement in Judah or in any area settled by Judaites, at least until the second half of the 8th century BCE. That is, at least until the reforms of Hezekiah. This is if you go purely by the biblical text, but probably also after. So both the archaeology and also the reforms by Josiah indicate that also after this we can still find them. It also indicates that, and this is if we also look at what we saw in Moza, that the early Judaite worship was very diverse and exhibited a syncretism of traditions from various ancient Near Eastern cultures. So again, not what at least I was raised on, where everything is very monolithic in the so-called Israelite religion. You know, there's a way of doing things and it's only Yahweh, etc. No, both the biblical and the archaeological evidence says very much otherwise. So if we look at why Moza is there, this I hope helps to kind of solidify the fact that Moza, the fact that there is a temple, shouldn't be a big surprise. Yeah, there were temples, there were cult places in different places. By the way, the big surprise is, how come we didn't find any more temples? Where are all the other temples in Judah? But I also think that there's a specific reason that Moza had this big temple, and here's the reason I think that it was built. So this is all based on the relationship between the temple or cult and regional economy. And I'm going to just indicate a few key elements before I describe why I'm going to this direction. And that is that throughout the Iron Age too, there's a clear lack of domestic buildings on the site. That is, there are a few buildings, 2, maybe 3, that could be domestic, but they could also not be domestic. We don't know. They're built based on the 4-room house plan, and that could be public or domestic. And the fact that the site began to act or to function as a granary even before the temple was built. And now I'm reminding you that the temple itself is built on a silo. So there were silos there before the temple was being built. So the function of the site as a granary, as a redistribution center, precedes the building of the temple. Throughout the Iron Age, from the 8th century on especially, we see an intensification of the function of the site. We see more and more silos being built. We see storage buildings being built. So probably as the agriculture is paying off, we have more people around, the function is intensifying. And the construction of the temple is a culmination of all of that. So for me, the temple is not the beginning, it's almost the end of a certain phase, which I will talk about now. So the link between religion and economy was inherent in the ancient Near East. And such a link has been mentioned for many different sites, such as the economic role in food and goods dispensation in Tel el-Mazar Mount A, to the north here in Transjordan, the metallurgical and agricultural industries at the temple at Dan, and the textile industry at Kuntil al-Hujud, Tel el-Khama, and Tel el-Amal. So in all of these sites, clear connection between the economy and cult places has been noted. The development of workshops that were constructed as an addendum to a temple, providing it with items needed for the maintenance of the temple staff and rituals, is attested throughout the region as well. So we have the production of textile that was associated with the cloths worn by the priest, suggested at Tel Tzafi and at Courtyard. So these are places where we have clear cultic places, and then we see that the economy is an addendum to these cult places in order to supply them with the materials that they need. The production of oil for libation was suggested at Dan. Pottery production, so the production of the actual vessels and the artifacts, was noted at Chatzor in the late Bronze Age temple in Area H and at the temple in Arad. And the metallurgy production suggested at Tel Dan, and recently in connection to 2 temples found at Tel Tzafi. So again, you have a temple, or you have a cult place, and then you have the addendum in the economical function. And I would suggest that in Moza we have the exact opposite. That is, that you first have the economical function, and that the temple was built as an addendum to that economy. And let me explain. So if you're basing your economy on agriculture, there are a few things you need. You need a lot of rainfall, especially when we're talking about the region of Judah, which is drier than your region, I would say. You need to have fertile soil. You need to make sure, or you need to hope that you'll have good growth for your harvest. And then, of course, harvesting and producing all of your produce. And so you're going to start to pray to the gods to give you water and fertile soil and good harvest. And that becomes, as you're intensifying your economy and you're expanding your agricultural venture, this becomes stronger and stronger. And so I think that what we have here are a number of different communities that all live within this valley I showed you, and they're pooling together their resources. And they've created an administrative site, which is Moza, in which they gather all of their produce and then redistribute it to whoever it is they're selling to. And as they're doing that, cult becomes more and more important, praying to the god or gods becomes more and more important, and when they have the ability, financially and manpower, they build a temple on their site. In doing so, they're building it on some of their silos, but it doesn't matter, they build some more silos around. And so the temple is really the culmination of what these societies are going through and the creation of this new economy in the region. What happens, and this we also know from the ancient Near East, is that with time, the very presence of the temple exerted an aura of sacred economy, in which the religious belief and ritual practices were utilized by the elite to ensure the integrity of the administrative system. So if it all started from the economy and then you create your cult place, that creates a hierarchy, and you have the priests and they start to dictate what the right way to behave, to perform your worship is, and eventually that whole system becomes something you're working towards. So it's kind of like it feeds into itself. And I think what we can then talk about is that what's happening in the region of Moza is that what we're seeing is really the creation of a new polity. This polity that can create the temple, that can build the temple. And the big question becomes, who are these people and what is their connection to Judah and Jerusalem? So Rinot and de Groot had noted, as I had mentioned, that Moza is part of the administrative system of the Kingdom of Judah and collaborates with Jerusalem. So basically it's the redistribution center for Jerusalem. But when does this relationship begin? Because according to them, they see it from the Iron 2b, from the 8th century on. But can we see it even earlier? And this is where it becomes a little bit of a pitfall. And here's our biggest problem. What do we even know about Judah in the early 9th century? And what do we know about it in the 10th century? And when I talk about Judah, in this case, I'm talking about Jerusalem. So there's very, very little And even the very little that actually exists is very, very highly contested. So people have a different notion of when to date things and how much actually exists. And right now, archaeologically, there really isn't much to attribute to Jerusalem in the 10th and early 9th centuries. So if Moza, or the community or communities around Moza, are strong enough and have a hierarchy and an administrative system that's strong enough to build a temple in an administrative site by the beginning of the 9th century, we don't have a corresponding Jerusalem for that. As we don't see that happening in Jerusalem. We can't talk about a centralized government in Jerusalem at that point. And so, is this part of Judah at this time? So that's the big question. Very, very carefully, right now, based on what we know, I would venture out and say, I don't think so. But we find new things all the time. If tomorrow there's a major building found in Jerusalem from the late 10th, early 9th century, then I'll be happy to say, okay, it's Jerusalem. Right now, the way I see it is as a local endeavor, something happening very locally that's based on all of those different sites that I showed you, and I'm sure that as we excavate more in the region, we'll find more and more of these Iron Age sites, and they're creating something local. I do believe that in the 8th century, they are absorbed into Jerusalem. By then they are. But whether they start out as being Judah and Jerusalem, right now it doesn't seem so, simply because we don't have Judah and Jerusalem right now. So this is the key element. So really, if I sum this up, the existence of the temple is a reflection of the complexity of the local communities in the Moza region and indicates a level of polity formation in the early 9th century in this region. Now, when they build this temple, they know what a temple in the ancient Near East is supposed to look like. They know what the plan is, so that means they have the knowledge. They know how to build it. They know how to create the artifacts. They know what motifs are prevalent in the iconography, the religious iconography of the ancient Near East. So they need the workmanship, they need the craftsmanship, and they need the ability to have a certain amount of people that can be set aside only to build the temple and don't have to produce. You know, we live in a surplus community. We're used to the fact that we don't have to go out and actually harvest our food every day in order to survive. But in ancient Near Eastern times, it's only a set polity that could actually put aside the manpower to do something that was not productive for the economy, per se. And so again, as I said, the creation of the temple in itself, in my mind, is already an indication of a polity that exists in this region in the beginning of the 9th century. So, summing up, that was a very, very general outlook at how I see Moza fitting into to the context of the ancient Near East. But here's a little bit, I just want to give you a few minutes of a look to the future and what has been done in the site since we finished excavating. So we finished in the summer of 2013. We didn't actually finish. We were basically kicked out of the site because they started construction of the road. And so the first thing that happened was that the site was completely backfilled. This was done by the Roads Authority with these layers of sand that you can see. And the site itself is actually right here. So they covered everything with sand, and then they drilled in down to the rock to put the pillars in and started to mount the road on top. And this is during the construction. Here's the location of the site. And this photo I especially want to show you because I want to show you that the place in which the road is the lowest above the slope, that's exactly when you're at the temple. So it's like right above the temple. And this is what it looked like when they finished. So they finished at the end of 2017, maybe the beginning of 2018, I don't remember exactly. So you have the old road to Jerusalem, the curve, the Moza curve, and then here's the new road and the site right here. This, by the way, is the mega project I was talking about that's going on now with the Neolithic site. So they're digging hundreds of squares. It's huge. And any of you who's coming to dig at Moza, we're going to be visiting this site as well. So it created a new landscape, the building of this bridge on top. And so here you can see the silos. We're right on the site here, the silos. You can still see some of the backfill, and you can see that the bridge is right above us. The temple is right over this little hump over here. And so we have a completely different, now when we'll be digging, we'll never be able to have a bird's eye view of the temple. We'll never be able to see it that way. We'll never be able to look at it and fully appreciate it within the topography. But I admit, it's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. Originally, the plan was that the bridge would be about 1.5 meters above the temple remains, but now it's about, I'd say, 8 meters above. So things could be worse. In the last few months, so since September of 2018, the Conservation Department of the Antiquities Authority has been removing the backfill, and they started to do some reconstruction and conservation of some of the remains. I stopped them when they got to the temple, yanked them out of there because I don't want anything being done, and you definitely can't reconstruct until we finish excavating, because how do you know what to reconstruct? But they're working around in the silos, and again, I'm hoping that they'll still be here, or still be doing that when we're excavating, because I actually think there's something kind of nice in seeing, the two sides of the story. The whole reason for this is because there is a plan to create a site. So not a national park, but a site that will be accessible to the public, and for the public to understand what they're seeing, put up some signs, etc. eventually. So here's the removal, and we're right in the middle of the temple. We're in the courtyard here. This is the entrance to the building. So you see most of the building is, the areas that we excavate are backfilled. Here's the altar, and then here's the pillar. See, so cut in right in the northern part of the courtyard. Again, glass half full. We still have the pit and we still have the altar, so it's something, right? So they didn't kill the whole everything. But this is what it looks like, a big heap of mess, which we will have to clean up and excavate. They did start consolidation, so they're not rebuilding, but they did consolidate. So I actually think the altar looked better before it was consolidated, but at least it's not going anywhere right now. So you see this concrete or whatever material they put inside. And talking about plans for the future, I am very happy to say that we can finally talk about new excavations beginning in Moza. We've waited for years and years until it was possible, and so we're going to start, as you know, the first season in a week and a half. And during that season, we're going to be doing some, I call it a surgical season, very, very specific things we want to check. For instance, so we want to find the western wall of the building. We never found the western edge of the building, and so we're going to reopen a square that we had just started right before we were kicked out last time. And hopefully we'll find that edge, so we'll be able to talk about the measurements of the building, which would be nice. We're going to excavate parts of the floors, and especially in the area of this flagstone pavement, and create a section. So finally we'll be able to answer this question: is the lower plaster floor found under the pavement, or are we really talking about two different chambers within the building? We're going to try and see whether there are more chambers to the north. So this is all very specific, and the most important thing is that throughout the different areas, different sections we have, we're going to be working very, very meticulously and sampling and taking soil samples and trying to incorporate any kind of scientific method that we know of. And here, just having a conversation now, there are more methods that I wasn't aware of, and so just taking samples so that we can use it for the future, because archaeology is destruction. The minute we excavate this, we can never go back, and we'll never have these samples again. So that's going to be a key element for us. And in that, I will thank you from the Lion of Zion, and we can have a discussion. Thank you very much.